It's probably fitting that the new Cold War topic, or new Cold War question mark topic, is the last topic, because I think a lot of what has been said throughout the day has bearings on what we're going to discuss now. So in a sense, this panel will probably sum up not only the kind of the foreign policy aspects of Russia, but also things we have said before today. So we have three distinguished speakers to talk about this issue. I will let them talk for about 10 minutes each, then I will have a couple of questions, and then we'll engage the audience, as the other panels, more or less. The first speaker would be Alexander Baunov. He is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Moscow Center, and he is also an editor of their website. Before that, he was a senior editor at the independent news site Slon.ru, which is now called, I think, Republic.ru. And if you don't know about this website, and if you know Russian, that is a great website to visit for update analysis of what's happening in Russia. So he will be the first speaker. The second speaker will be Christian Caryl, who is editor at the opinion section of the Washington Post. And he's also an editor of a blog called DemocracyPost. And he has written a book which is called Strange Rebels, which, as far as I understand, is a book about 1 year, 1979. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. I always thought somebody should write a book about that year, so that's a good. It's good that you did that. And then finally, Julie Wilhelmsen. Most of you know her already, but she's a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. And she's a frequent voice on Russian affairs, both in this country and beyond its borders. And she is also the author of a book called Russia's Securitization of Chechnya, How War Became Acceptable. So those are the speakers, and then without further ado, I will give the floor to Alexander Baunov, please. Baunov.
Yeah.
Baunov, we discussed that, Baunov.
So, and before Sloan, I was in Newsweek Moscow edition, and before that in Russian Foreign Ministry, something that makes me suspicious now. And before that, because that's a highly cultural audience, I was professor of ancient Greek and Latin. So, really. Irina Prokhorova, in one of the morning sessions, mentioned that there are not only differences, but also something that makes us similar. And one thing that makes the behavior of Russian political class and American political class similar is the fear and the feeling of stolen victory. Many things that many actions of Russian government, Putin's government, are motivated by this feeling of stolen victory in the Second World War, and the world order created after the Second World War, which means that all these terrible victims had been in vain. Now, what motivates the behavior of American political class is the feeling of stolen victory in the Cold War. So the old adversary, the old enemy is back. It is strong again, so it has to be defeated again. So this peculiar feeling is now shared by both political establishments. And there had been many theories about what motivates Russia's behavior and makes it how it is look in international scene. There was a common theory that it is all about money. The other common theory was that, or explanation, it was all about power. Both explanations clashed with reality. All about money means that Russian leadership is a classical mafia state. They steal money at home and conceal them abroad, to have good lives abroad and to send their children to more civilized, more developed countries. It clashed, of course, this theory had been overturned with Russian foreign adventures with Russian foreign behavior. Russia could not be doing things that harm this foreign spending and foreign so to steal money at home and send them abroad. And it did it in Crimea, and before, if you follow the whole previous history in Georgia, and even the Yeltsin regime had contradictions with the West in foreign policy. The theory that all is about power or whatever Russian regime is doing is motivated or explained by Putin's approval rating clashed with reality quite recently with the pension reform. The pension reform is highly unpopular. Up to 90% of Russians are against. Nevertheless, it was supported openly. I mean, the increasing of retirement age, it was openly supported by Putin. Actually, why? Because it makes Russia more competitive with the rest of the world. And this idea of global competitiveness, or to being globally competitive, is very important for the modern Russian regime. If you are not competitive, you cannot realize, you cannot fulfill your global ambitions. And why should the country and its leadership and its elite have global ambitions? It's not only the matter of the size or the matter of history, but it also the perception that Russia is too big to be left alone. It's even defeated after the end of the Cold War. It is potential competitor. So the perception that is shared both by Russian political elite, big part of Russian economic elite, and Russian populations, average Russians, is that Russia is too big, it's potentially too powerful to be just left alone. So if you don't don't implement your global ambitions, if you don't go in the world, the others, so the Westerners, the world comes to your country and do something with your country. And it's supported, of course, with the history of 20th century, when really the West invited twice Russia during the both world wars, and then the Russian state collapsed twice during the revolution, and then in 1991, and the suspicion is that this process was supported from abroad. So the Russian global ambitions is the mean of survival in the hostile environment. And what is seen is an aggression from inside Russia sometimes, or not sometimes, but in most of the times is seen as a counteroffensive, counterattack. Let's take the internet, the web. When the web is now seen as a field of Russian aggression, but for Putin and for the Kremlin, the web is a hostile enemy's territory. The web is invented, internet is invented in the United States, as Putin himself put it once, by the CIA. The servers, so the equipment is placed in the West. All major social media and social and websites, and generally all the most influential global media on the web are Western. And you remember this euphoria of Arab Spring, and before Moscow protest, and before that several other mass protests in Kiev and in other countries that were analyzed as web revolutions, Twitter revolutions. So the web is a totally hostile environment for Putin. And the solution was or to cut it off completely or to put a firewall, as was made in China. But by that time, Russia was already connected to the rest of the world with thousands of cables. As well, China is connected to the world with around 200 cables, and all of them are state-owned or owned by state companies. Russia is connected with 2,500 cables, and most of them are private. So to cut Russia off the web, you have basically to destroy one of the branches of economy that makes Russia competitive. And there is a contradiction. You make the regime safer, but you undermine what you are searching for, the competitivity, the competitive or competitive. What's the
connectivity?
Yeah, no, конкурентоспособность, how to say?
Oh, competitiveness.
Competitiveness, yeah.
Sorry.
And in the beginning of Putin's time, the Russian state had no developed capacities to serve this branch of economy, so the dot-com economy, the internet economy. They didn't have people. They didn't have equipment. It was all in private hands. So they decided to strike back. My first knowledge about so-called trolls or internet trolls is around 2005, 2004, 2005 and 2006. And they were absolutely not for attacking the West. They were hired to resist in the hostile internet to the Western pressure. And then this first resistance gradually developed in the possibility of, like say, make offensive operations. But even when they are offensive operations, they are perceived by Russian political establishment and by those who are who participate in them as counterattack. It's not an aggressor; it's a guerrilla fighter. Is what guerrilla fighter is doing aggressive? Yes, he put fire in the village. Yes, but in his minds, it's not an aggression; it's a counterattack. So it's how can what Russia is doing in the foreign scene be explained from inside, not of the Putin's might, of course. I never go so far, but from inside of what Russian establishment is thinking and what is shared by not the majority, but many of Russians. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor to be here. Thanks to the Fritt Ord Foundation and the New York Review Books Foundation as well. It's really a tremendous pleasure to be here. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about what I see as a fundamental paradox underlying Russian behavior. I call it the Putin Paradox. So on the face of things, Russia is firmly anchored in the international order. It's a member of the UN Security Council, the World Trade Organization, the G20, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Organization, even the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, though that may not be lasting much longer. Russia, at the same time, is the country that is responsible for one of the most fundamental breaches of the international order since 1945, the annexation of Crimea. Its membership in the G8 has been suspended, largely as a result of that annexation, and it is laboring under an array of sanctions. Through proxies, it effectively occupies territory in several of its neighboring countries and is engaged in armed conflict with 2 of them. So there's a profound tension between Russia's current global position and its aspirations. There's a fundamental paradox. Russia currently has the characteristics of both the status quo power. It's very much invested in the existing global order. I was very struck by your mention of the internet cables. But it also has some traits of a revisionist power. I have a lot of friends in Washington who see Russia pure and simple as a revisionist power. I don't think that's quite accurate. Russia, of course, Vladimir Putin above all, wishes to be taken very seriously as a global player, but it is often promoting that aim by unconventional and remarkably destructive methods, thereby undermining its own efforts to a certain extent. In the Cold War, there was a kind of equilibrium. The USSR and the United States had an uneasy parity in military terms. They were in direct ideological conflict, which shaped their relations with the countries that came under their imperial influence. They divided the world into 2 competing camps. Now today that equilibrium is gone. Russia remains a considerable military power, especially in relation to its own neighbors. It has an extremely well-educated populace and quite a bit of extraordinary know-how. Yet, as some of the speakers earlier today have noted, it is an economic weakling, plagued by corruption and cronyism, despite its vast natural resources. And this does limit its ability to project military power. It has few genuine allies. And as other participants have noted today, it is not offering a distinct ideological model that competes with that of the West, despite its own protestations to the contrary. Right, we talked about, there were varying views. I think there was a kind of consensus in the end. Maybe Ben Nathans and Masha Lippman will correct me, but I think there was a kind of consensus that traditionalism or conservatism is a good catch-all term for Russia's ideology, but at the same time, those labels are so broad that they're almost not very useful. Yes, and as far as ideology goes, many members of Russia's ruling elite are happy to park their money in Europe or the United States, or to educate their children there, which is hardly the indicator of a principled philosophical rejection. So what we have seen in recent years is a systematic attempt by Russia to regain some sort of parity with the West. But how could it overcome these fundamental asymmetries? And again, I was very struck by your remark that when Russians don't necessarily see aggressive acts as aggression, but as a kind of guerrilla warfare. And I think that's a very striking turn of phrase, because what we do in fact see is a whole series of asymmetric actions that are designed to bolster Russia's standing in the world when conventional means don't quite do the trick. And I was very struck, perhaps I'm overly obsessed with this quote, I quote it all the time, by something that was said by, I believe it was Andrei Krutskih, who was the special representative of President Putin on international cooperation and on information security. And in 2016, he made this remarkable statement. We can't take this at face value, of course, because, how much power does this guy have? To what extent is he actually speaking for the Russian establishment? But still, it's quite a striking statement. At an event in 2016, he said, "You think we are living in 2016? No, we are living in 1948. And do you know why? Because in 1949, the Soviet Union had its first atomic bomb test. And if until that moment, the Soviet Union was trying to reach agreement with Truman to ban nuclear weapons, and the Americans were not taking us seriously," very important formulation, the Americans were not taking us seriously, in 1949, everything changed. And they started talking to us on an equal footing. Again, very striking formulation. I'm warning you, we are at the verge of having something in the information arena which will allow us to talk to the Americans as equals. again, I don't want to take this at face value. You know, was he really speaking for, you know, Mr. Prigozhin and the Internet Research Agency? I don't know that. But again, it is a very striking reflection of a certain mentality within the Russian establishment, talking to the Americans as equals. Now, how would Russia close that gap? Certainly there are many conventional means of doing that, and we've seen that with Russia's very vigorous attempts at military reform, which has seen a return of an old Cold War template, you know, planes flying into each other's territory to test alert times, and things like that. But there's also been a great deal of asymmetrical measure, a large number of asymmetrical measures in the equation, a kind of toolbox of means for unconventional power projection. And you could say cyber war, disinformation, overseas assassinations, influence operations in the United States and European politics, proxy war in Ukraine. Regime support in Syria, for me, is kind of a borderline case, because in many ways that's a very conventional, almost Cold War kind of proxy warfare, but it also has some very unconventional aspects, like the use of private mercenaries, which is a very interesting one, who have actually been in combat with American forces in Syria, Russian private mercenaries. So that's, I just wanted to sketch that out. I don't want to talk too much longer about it because I'd much rather hear you ask questions. But I just wanted to make this point that I do believe that we face a certain fundamental contradiction in relations with Russia. This sense that Russia aspires to be a status quo power on some level, and some level is, and yet it seems to be achieving that aspiration by unconventional and sometimes rather destructive means, which lends a great deal of volatility to the current world situation. Russia isn't the only country responsible for that volatility, but I think that this structure implies a great deal of volatility, and I think the events just over this past week in the Kerch Strait underlines that point. So how do we capture this contradiction in a catchy, you know, international conference phrase that I can then copyright and make millions of dollars off of? You know, the G nothing, or, you know, whatever. I don't know, you can help me. I come up with a few. You know, Russia is a conservative disruptor, which is kind of reminds me, yep, I'm almost done, actually. Not unlike the guy in the White House, right? Which, again, shows a certain kind of identity between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. An institutionalized insurgent might be a good one. Or, you know, just plain status quo revisionist. I don't know. You know, I don't think Russia is a rogue state, but it certainly adopted some of the practices of rogue states in a very selective and targeted way. And yet I think it's also very much an establishment power in a lot of ways. So how do we find a comfortable way to embrace these contradictions? I don't know, I'm still looking, but I'd love to hear what you think. Thanks very much.
Okay, so usually you can say, I'm standing between you and your lunch. Now I feel like saying, I'm standing between you and your bed in Norway in November. So I'm very thankful that you're going to listen to what I have to say. And I'm going to say something I've said many times these 4 past years. But I think it's very important, and very important on this panel, in fact. I want to talk about the aspect of mutuality in Russia-Western relations. So yes, Russia has become an authoritarian state. Russia did annex Crimea. Russia has a conscious policy of turning the tide of influence, not going from west to east, but going from east to west. But the level of tension in Russia-West relations today, the new Cold War, as some call it, is not only about Russia. It springs from relations between these two political entities. And I will argue from the changing definition of self and other by these political entities. So to answer the question which Tord sent out to all of us, what does Russia want in its relations with Russia? I think you have to look at how Russia defines itself, what role it says it wants to have in the world, and how it defines the West. To understand Russia-West relations, we have to study mutual understandings, how they change, and which policies have been implemented on the basis of these understandings. So I will sketch these changing understandings very briefly on both sides and argue that today we have an escalating conflict, not only in the military strategic sphere, but in the sphere of values. It's been touched upon already today, and even by default in the economic sphere. And then I'll try to tie some comments on Norway into this, since after all, we are in Norway, which is part of the West. So on the Russian side, the West has moved from an example to follow, or a core partner, or a big brother in the 1990s, to become an enemy. And this has happened gradually. The new enmity perceived from Russia's side in the military strategic sphere started this, and was limited. It was limited to this sphere first, but it actually started very early. It was NATO expansion. It was Kosovo in 1999. It was the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which the Russian leadership saw as a threat, both to the kind of equal partnership it thought that it had with the United States of America in the fight against terrorism and against international law. Then there was an incident around the terrorist attack in Beslan, where you saw very clearly in the rhetoric of the Russian leadership that they thought that the West was fueling terrorism in order to keep Russia down. Then if you move up to 2007, it's the famous speech in Munich where Putin states that there will be no absolute security for the USA at the expense of others. And then the year after, the events in Georgia in 2008. These are very complicated events with many aspects, but I think for the Russian leadership, there was a core aspect of seeing the US hand into Russia's near abroad. And from this year, Russia has implemented policies on this understanding of the West constituting a threat in the military strategic sphere. First of all, with its actions in Georgia. And secondly, I think, from really starting the modernization of the Russian military from 2008 onwards. So this is the combination, of course, of both a new view of the West as a threat and a new and changing view of Russia really becoming and being again a great power. Then the new enmity became manifest in the values sphere. Now, a turn away from democracy and human rights, the way the West dictated them, started actually already in 2003, I would argue, with the notion of double standards, which appears again and again in Russian official rhetoric. And also the idea that Western values promotion really is self-serving. It's not true values promotion. It's a tool to keep Russia down. And then, of course, we move up to 2012, and then there's this embrace of, or trying to construct a kind of different civilization, an opposite civilization of the Western civilization. They talk about traditional values, God is not dead, there's a difference between right and wrong morals, and so on. And a very explicit demand for a diversity of values in world politics. And this new understanding of an enmity in the values sphere was implemented to some extent in the vision of a Eurasian Union, which was supposed to be based then on different values than the ones you have in the West. And then secondly, as I said, a conscious strategy of really turning the tide. So communicating into the West Russia's point of view of world politics, and in a way what the West did in the 1990s to Russia, influencing politics, internal politics, we will now we will do it against you. And I think, seen from the Kremlin, the crisis in Ukraine was a challenge in both these two spheres, both in the military strategic sphere and in the value sphere, particularly because of the close connections Ukraine were aiming for with the EU. Then in the third sphere, the economic sphere, I think that Russia still is and sees this sphere as a potential sphere of collaboration with the West. And I actually don't think that has changed. If we move on now to the Western side, the view of Russia in the 1990s as a normal state, that Russia would become like us, has been deep-seated. And if you look at the Norwegian context in particular, we have used 20 years of investment, both as people and economically, in kind of thinking that Russia would become like us. Russia would become a normal, in our eyes, society. And this liberal expectations lasted much, much longer than there were grounds for those of us who followed what was going on inside Russia. We already, when Putin came to power, were seeing how the power vertical was, in a way, taking shape. But this liberal expectation has lasted. Then simultaneously, the belief grew in the West that the West could and should spread its values and political system worldwide, even through the barrel of a gun. And if you look at the Norwegian context again, I have been going through lots of Norwegian texts, official texts, and the liberal interventionist agenda, if you want to call it that, actually takes hold in Norwegian foreign policy. And the idea that Russia represents a threat in the value sphere appears before the annexation of Crimea in Norway's relation to Russia. Then after Crimea, the sanctions regime imposed by the West was construed as a mild kind of punishment for what had happened. But ironically, the consequence of this, and you see it very clearly in Norway, is that the sphere, the economic sphere, which used to be thought of as a possible sphere for collaboration, where trust would be built and so on, is now just locked into this conflictual relation. And of course, the tendency, if we look at what's happening in Washington these days, is to use more and more of that, economic sanctions. Then finally, after Crimea, Russia is again represented and understood as a military security threat to the West, and NATO as the morally just defender against an assertive and assertive and aggressive Russia, I should say. And the implementation of these new understandings we see quite clearly in the rolling out of the new deterrence initiatives across Eastern Europe and through the building of stronger ties today with, for example, Georgia and Ukraine, non-NATO members. In Norway, we see it in the eagerness of Norwegian policies to make Norway into NATO in the north. And this push to make Norway into NATO in the north, I would say, overshadows other types of collaboration with Russia, other impulses to collaborate with Russia. This is not said officially, but this is my observation, built on the sources I have read. So, building on these mutually incompatible understandings of self and other, and I've tried to tell the story of how it's happened on both sides, and in these three spheres, I would argue that we have quite a multifaceted and intense conflictual relation. And the absurd thing is that if you look at the Norwegian case, for example, Russia does not constitute a threat to Norway. Norway does not constitute a threat to Russia as a NATO country. I don't think either that the US or Russia actually constitute threats to each other, but still, the tension keeps rising. And why does it keep rising? And I have just two ideas I want to share with you. One is the quest for unity and internal cohesion in these polities themselves. This is actually my expertise is actually on the Chechen war. And my main argument in my book is I try to show how Chechnya was made into a terrorist threat and how it helped create cohesion in the Russian polity. And this, is a mechanism which Putin has used skillfully several times. So it's moved from the terrorist threat and then to the Western threat. You know, Ukrainian threat not so successful, but it still had for some time this function. And then if you look at the United States of America, yes, there is a Russian revanchism directed at the USA, but the threat is extremely exaggerated as I read US papers and the debate as it goes. And it is too convenient to point to this new Russian threat in the US context of disunity today. It seems to be the only thing that, for example, the Democrats and the Republicans can unite on. Yes, Russia is a threat. So even in Norway, which I would argue is not a disunited society in a very strong way, probably because we're lucky with our economy and everything, we still have a growing fear if we look at the official documents. This is my last point. If you look at the official documents, that, you know, our West is breaking up, the transatlantic unity is breaking up, and Europe is breaking up. And actually, the Russia threat is kind of convenient to create cohesion in our Western bloc. The final point I want to make, which I really want to talk about, so I hope somebody asks me this question. The other notion which goes on, the other idea which is very strong on both sides in this conflict, is the idea that we should not listen to the other. In Russia, there's an understanding that the Western talk has been aimed at undermining us. We won't listen any longer. Nothing you say is going to help us. In the West, we have the same type of understanding. Russia is all about fake news. We even have our own government dismissing several times when Russian officials come with their so-called list of grievances, just saying, this is propaganda, we don't listen to that. That's extremely dangerous. If two parties in a conflict can dismiss everything the other party says as a lie. So that's the reason why this conflict is still escalating and why it's difficult to wind it down. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah, this is actually on. Oh, very good. Thank you, all three. Great presentations, quite different presentations, all within the confines of the topic of the panel, but still very different. So that's very good. I have two questions, and they are for the whole panel, and I will ask them both consecutively, and then you can answer whatever you want, and then we'll give the floor to the audience. My first question is more of a should question. Do you think there is anything that the West could and should give Russia in order to reduce tensions? I know, for example, that adherence to the realist tradition within international relations, they have suggested, for example, that the West should stop telling Russian leaders to their face how they should run their country. So that could be one thing. Another thing could be some of the same realists have asked that the West should let Russia have more of a free hand in the post-Soviet area because it's their zone of interest. So there are those out there in the West who suggest different things that could be given to Russia in order to reduce tensions. So I wonder if you have anything that you think the West should and could give to Russia. That's the first question. The second one goes back to things that were said before today. Maxim Trudolyubov talked about the game of the weak, and Benjamin Nathans talked about, or he quoted somebody who had referred to Vysotsky, and Vysotsky had talked about in Russia the specific Russian combination of boldness and despair. So the question is, do you think that the current Russian leadership is acting towards the West with a feeling of confidence or with a feeling of insecurity? Thank you. And maybe we should go in the opposite order. Is that okay? So Julie starts first and then...
Okay, confidence or insecurity?
Insecurity.
Should I use the mic?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I think initially insecurity, and I think what Russia has been seeking, if you can say Russia like that, the Russian leadership is probably a better word, is some kind of acknowledgement. I think that's a very important word. It's often used respect, but I think acknowledgement. By now, I don't think they feel inferior. I actually think, and I think it's also, they don't feel inferior also because they actually feel they have much more backing than we pretend they do. Because we often say, oh, the entire international society is against Russia, it's isolated and so on. But if you look worldwide, that's actually not true. Russia actually has a lot of support for many things. It says, I'm not saying that's good, but it's a fact. It says in China, in India, in Turkey, in the Middle East particularly. So that would be my answer to that. And then second one, what should we give Russia? I think the first thing, the main problem is the problem of trust. So I think the first thing we could give Russia is simply to be very careful to stick to the principles we say are our main asset. We claim that we are the good values. So we have to really stick to those values. And I think a small thing would be when a new thing happens, like what happened in the Kerch Strait the other day, or with the Skripal murders, or whatever it is, to not conclude before we have the evidence would be a good first step. Because it means that we are playing by the rules ourselves. And Russia's long-standing claim is that we're operating with double standards. So just to stick to our own rules would be a good start.
Sure. Well, as far as the second question goes, I think I would cast a vote for insecurity. I don't see the Russian leadership operating out of a feeling of confidence. I don't think that you do some of these things that have happened lately out of a sense of confidence. I don't know, maybe that's probably enough said on that. Now, what should the West give to Russia to reduce tensions? I think there's a common mistake that's made when someone says, you know, I'm in favor of sanctions and I'm in favor of a fairly tough response to the annexation of Crimea, which I include myself in that camp. I'm in favor of quite a forceful response. I'm in favor of sanctions. And I think every time that Russia oversteps a serious boundary, there should be consequences. And that is often depicted as, well, you're against talking to the Russians, or, you know, you're against cooperation. Not at all. In fact, I'm very much in favor of arms talks, cooperation on North Korea, which is one area where we have a lot of overlapping interests, and a whole host of other things. I don't think those are mutually exclusive positions. There's a whole range of areas, particularly in military security in Europe, where we need desperately to be talking to the Russians. What I certainly oppose is a position that says, because we need to talk to the Russians on these other issues, we should just close an eye when they assassinate somebody with a chemical agent in the UK. So I think that's fairly clear. So I would say, actually, I wholeheartedly agree that we need to go on talking, but I think we need to do that in a spirit of great frankness and, well, as you said, sticking to our values. I think sticking to our values is a great position.
What is trust? How it works? It works? Yeah, it is. It was trust or insecurity? Confidence or insecurity, yeah, okay. Insecurity, of course. A lot changed between 2008 and 2012, although this was Medvedev's presidency, which is, well, liberal technocrat with completely different rhetoric than late Putin. But in 2008, 2009, it was a world economic crisis. And Russia, not just the government, but the business community lost a lot of confidence into Western economy because Russia followed all major receipts of global economists. It has very professional economists in its government still, and at that time were very low international debt, very low state debt, targeting inflation, and all good things. But suddenly, some poor Americans didn't pay their mortgages, and everything collapsed. But why should Russians suffer, who already suffered, to repay their foreign debts because some poor Americans didn't pay their mortgages? And then it was when, to my opinion, Putin personally, not all economists on his around him, but personally lost a big part of confidence in the in how the whole world market economy works, and that it's necessary make benefit for Russia. And then in 2012 it was Magnitsky Act, which was well, justified measure because an American citizen died in Russian prison, but they had two consequences. One was that for Putin himself again, as far as I can analyze, of course, his behavior, because we don't speak, as you understand, to each other. It was, well, many Russians, not enormous, not so many, but some Russians die in prisons. And this one, he saw Magnitsky as somebody from this dirty 90s. And that was the person who was supported by the whole bulk of Western political tools and media tools. And for him and people like him, it was a sign of that the West is looking for pretext to pressure Russia, because it was exactly the day when Jackson-Vanik amendment was lifted after many years that it lost any sense, and the same days the new sanctions were introduced. And among Russian elite, it saw an insecurity feeling because the list of sanctioned people was hidden, and then the very idea that your properties can be confiscated in the West and you can be sanctioned or deprived of some properties in the West was make some more dubious about should we really be a part of Western elite or Western establishment, because before 2008 and later years, the main direction was the Russian elite wanted to be a part of Western elite. Of course, so-called equal partner, equal part on equal terms, but the movement was to this direction. And what to give, if you remember the Euromaidan in Ukraine, was that so many young people were in the streets for visa-free travel to Europe. So if we remember, it was that time when I was in the Russian foreign ministry, so the last Yeltsin year and three first Putin's years, it was a national idea, not even more of the government than of the population, the visa-free regime. Basically, at that time, government was Russian Euromaidan. They wanted to promote Russian investment in Europe and attract as much as possible European investments in Russia, and to make the idea was all common besides institutions. Means that trade, goods, people movement, and so on, only the decisions are taken separately. It's not clear how it is acceptable for Europe, but for visa regime, I told recently in one of the major European embassies, not a small one, but one of the leading European countries, it's only, this, 0.003 rejections. So you staff consulates, and many Russians travel to the cities where there are consulates to be basically approved for travel, and only 0.003 applications are rejected. It means that all this huge work is in vain, or almost in vain, because the same rejections could be done in the border. And my impression, of course, it's difficult to prove, but if Russia and Europe had visa-free regime during first 2 years of Putin rule, when he was, let's say, pushing Russia into the West rather than attacking the West as it is doing now, the whole thing could develop differently. It's not, of course, necessarily so, but the atmosphere could be quite different. Yeah.
I'm very struck that you did not mention the Libya intervention in 2011. Was not so big for you, or? I mean, the things you mentioned were very interesting, but I was very struck because usually that's one of the first things that comes up. So also, but not so important as the others?
I suppose less, yeah.
Okay, just curious.
Okay, we have 15 minutes for Q&A. I see already 2 hands. Let's take 3 questions in a row. So first here, there, and you. Fine.
Hello. Yes. Alexander, I'd like to take off from something you said in your original remarks. You said that in the eyes of Putin, Russia is too big and potentially powerful to be left alone, that it will eventually be threatened, therefore, and needs to act to protect itself. And of course, some of those actions are perceived in the West as aggressive actions. Now, how does that square with what you just said in answering the question about Putin's being ready in the first 2 years after 2000 to, as it were, join the West? The reason I say how does it square, because this notion that Russia is too big and potentially powerful to be left alone is, as it were, a permanent condition. And if that's the case, then how does one explain the argument that you made, but Putin himself has made, which is that rather than being permanently threatened, because it's too big and powerful to be left alone, it has been slowly convinced that the West is threatening by a series of Western actions: NATO expansion, bombing of Yugoslavia, Iraq war, Libya. This implies a kind of learning process in which Putin is convinced by Western actions to beware of the West, whereas what you said before implies he was already convinced by a permanent condition, namely, Russia is too big and potentially powerful to be left alone. And one final coda to this question is, if he's permanently convinced that Russia is permanently threatened, then this whole story of how the tension could have been avoided if the West had acted otherwise, not expanded NATO, not bombed Yugoslavia, not entered Iraq, has to be wrong. In other words, it becomes an excuse for blaming the West when, in effect, Putin was originally convinced from the very beginning that no matter what the West does, it's going to be a threat for the very reason you gave.
Okay. Hartmut Meyer from the Europeum. I have thousands of questions, but I reduce myself to 2. One for Christian and one for Julie. For Christian, I mean, your quote that we are in 1948. Aren't we possibly, as far as cybersecurity is concerned, in 1956, i.e. the year before the Sputnik shock? Because in the cybersecurity space, when I talk to experts, it's not talking as equals, it's potentially talking to superiors. And the argument is that Israel, China, and Russia have much better capacity than the Western world. And the argument being that the best IT experts in these three countries work for the state, while in the West they work for the private sector because of salaries and so on. So the fittest brains in that sphere are working for the state, and we are actually ready very soon, as you indicated, for Sputnik shock in cyberspace, and then we're not talking among equals, we're talking defensively from a Western perspective. On Julie, your narrative about the sort of perceptions West and East and Russia and so on, and you alluded to China, you alluded to the Middle East, you alluded to Turkey and so on. Isn't the analogy we're in the Second World War misleading, because we're not talking about bipolarity anymore, and we're not talking about these countries being the leaders of the two parts of the world, but in a multipolar, whatever we want to describe, and we can go through many visions of global order. But the rise of China, does that actually change the whole perception? Because if I listen to the Trump people, I think they're crazy, but one message that always comes through, it's about a G2 world where it's all about China. And now we're messing with Europe a bit, we're messing with Russia a bit in order to make them feel vulnerable, in order to come behind Washington when we really fight against China. What do you think about that line of argument? I know it's crude and it's Trumpian and so on, but what do you think about the China dimension in the Cold War 2.0 that we're discussing today? So thank you.
Just a footnote question to Alexander. I really appreciated your giving a kind of insider perspective on Russia's relations with the world. Did I hear you say that one of the reasons behind the negative reaction to the Magnitsky Act was the perception that he was an American citizen, and that Browder and company were going to bat for him? Because I've never heard that Magnitsky was an American citizen, and did I mishear that?
Probably he was not, but he was working for America.
Okay, all right. So the notion is that the intervention on his behalf was only due to his connection to an American company. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, you can stop.
Well, again, when Putin started, Russia has deep state too. So when I suddenly...
Shocked to hear that.
Yeah. When I started in 1999, after my academic career, my diplomatic career, many Russian diplomats, and there were two streams, one inherited from Soviet time and the other newcomers from very different spaces, because there was staff shortages, because many staff left for private business and private companies. It's a huge world. The Soviet state was total. There was nothing beside the state. And suddenly, in 1991 and after, the huge private space rise near the state. So many diplomats left from, and special service people, including Putin himself, left the special services and went to this private sector. And the Soviet diplomat, of course, they continued the big game of old style. And for them, Putin was a continuation of Yeltsin policy. It was too pro-Western, too capitalist. And of course, in their spravka, so in their files they prepared for him, they tried to influence the foreign policy to be more be more consecutive, to be more similar to what the traditional Soviet and Russian foreign policy was. And of course, the pressure from the Kremlin and from the government was to be more open, more economic-minded, more business-minded, to serve more interests of Russian business abroad than purely political interests. For instance, in 2003, Greece was trying to sell its oil refinery, and there were several Russian companies competing for it, and the embassy had how to say, not the order, but well, the advice to help as much as possible all major companies It was 2002. Among them was Lukoil, but Yukos was among them too. So as far as 2002, the embassy received the advice to help all big Russian private companies to compete for this oil field, oil refinery. And yes, the intention was that, the idea was that Russian interests could be more secured when Russian business establishment, new class of owners, of big owners, would become a part of global capitalist elite. And the same with political elite, of course. And yes, the suspicions existed again from the very beginning, because it was the Second Chechen War, and all were convinced that Russia is treated too critical and too unjust for what it does in Chechnya, that Chechen warriors are idealized, that Russian soldiers are, well, demonized as usual, and so it was the same years. But the perception is that let's move towards being equal part, but part of the Western establishment, both in economy, in market economy, and in foreign policy decision-making process. Yes, and after some disappointments, and the list of grievances, it's well known. It sometimes is justified, sometimes it's rather exaggerated, of unequal treatments, and the other moods that probably pre-existed. So probably Putin's personal conventions that pre-existed his presidential power, they overtook. And now but again, what Putin is building in Russia, it's not something very different from the West. Of course, he is more conservative than the leading Western countries, but it's not more conservative than many conservative forces, legitimate conservative political forces are proposing in the West. So it's not extreme form of conservatism, and it is not an alternative model of economy or of a society. Basically, he is continuing to build a Western-style society, a Western-style economy with peculiarities, but it's not an alternative in the sense that Soviet Union was proposing to build, follow us, and we know the better way, or as the dictatorships of, classical dictatorships of 20th century, like Mussolini or Franco or Hitler proposed. It's a more or less variation of the Western society and the Western economy. And just when they failed to join the Western elite as an equal part of its elite, they are building the West for themselves. A special pocket, a special case of the Western society near the West.
To be continued.
You have your own. Oh, no. Okay.
Let me give that to you
Okay.
as
Yes.
something I can give to Russia. So about the cyber question, I think one of the really startling things about the 2016 campaign and all of the skullduggery that was involved was how astonishingly terrible American cyber hygiene is. It reminds me a little bit of the period before 9/11 when we innocently thought you don't need to search people before they get on airplanes. I mean, the fact that Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman would be spearphished you know, by a couple of guys in a building in Moscow is pretty extraordinary, but that seems to be exactly what happened because, you know, cybersecurity, the level of our cybersecurity is really in the Stone Age. And yes, I mean, again, I always return to the point that Russia has, you know, one of the things Russia does extremely well is education, especially in the technical sphere. And they have some of the best computer people in the universe. I think the Chinese and the Israelis are actually kind of trying to catch up. So I do think there's a bit of a Sputnik moment there. I mean, needless to say, we are not helpless when it comes to cyber technology, but I think 2016 revealed the extent we were just being sloppy and ignorant, and maybe a bit of a national awakening on that score would be a good thing. Unfortunately, the Trump administration, you know, has been completely lacking in any sort of comparable sense of urgency. I wonder why.
Okay, so I think I'll just start with a quick comment on your question, because you were saying, you know, that there are permanent conditions here. The point of my talk was to put the words, you can hear me now? To put the words changing perceptions of self and other, because I think we have a problem when we think that Russia is a static social entity. It is changing. Its understanding of what itself is and what it wants to be in the world changes. So this need to be secure was in the beginning for the Russian leadership of Putin's reign to secure the Russian borders. So it was, you know, Chechen separatism was obviously important to create the new strong state within the borders of the Federation. But then the image of what Russia should be changes. So that's just a comment to your, you know, so actually, yes, the conditions might be permanent in one sense, but the interpretations of what we are and who our friends and enemies are, they change, and that matters for how you act. I know that's a very constructivist way of putting it, but I think we're missing something if we don't try to think in these terms. Then on the question of multipolarity, as we all know, multipolarity has been an aim for Russia from 1996 when it was coined by Primakov, right? But I would say that multipolarity was kind of the answer to the problem of unipolarity and the understanding that Russia was in no position to create a bipolar world. Maybe it wanted to, but it couldn't. So it had to stick with this multipolar vision. And if you look at it over time, it's quite fascinating how this vision is, you know, in a way coming true and being worked towards as an aim. And in relation to China, my observation would be that, yes, Russia and China have worked quite consciously to build a partnership for many years, many more years than we think. But it come 2014, and it really was like, you know, it's the rejection of the West and by the West which really pushes this partnership forward. So it's more Russia and China uniting against US dominance and lack of respect for their, what they think are their legitimate interests, than maybe that there are so many commonalities. Were it only China and Russia in the world, I'm not so sure they would be friends.
And by that, our time is up. I have been asked by the organizers to remind you that there is a poetry reading tonight at 9 o'clock, and there are also events taking place tomorrow, including a film screening. You'll find the details in the panel. I wish you a safe trip home, and let's end this marvelous day by giving the panel a round of applause.